Judith, thank you. Thank you for coming to Brighton.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for agreeing to do the interview. The conference has been fantastic, but also challenging and difficult at times.
Yes.
Could I begin by asking you about the session we've just been in and the discussions around gender violence, which you've written about recently, the claims about gender ideology. What does one do? How does one respond to the situation? 30 years ago, you challenged these discourses, and there seems to be almost a return of the repressed.
It's true. Well, first let me thank you, Mark, for inviting us here and for collaborating both with Boğaziçi University in Istanbul and the International Consortium of Critical Theory Programs at Berkeley. This has been a...
And thank you for the support.
Oh, well,
I know our colleagues in Boğaziçi are incredibly grateful, but it's awful we couldn't do it there.
Yes, it's awful that we couldn't do it there, but you know, this is interesting as an academic conference because it intersects with the political world immediately. Who can travel here? Who can get a visa? And some of our Turkish colleagues were able to do that, and others were not. There are immediately questions of who can be filmed and who cannot, who's free to speak and who is not.
And indeed, Zeynep, one of the co-organizers, we'd invited her to do this with us, but she's worried about the possible consequences when she returns.
Yes, yes. Several of the Turkish participants signed the petition for peace, which was a document calling on the Turkish government to resume diplomatic negotiations with representatives of the Kurdish people. Yep. And that has been nefariously misconstrued by the Turkish government as an alliance with Kurdish violence. They were promoting diplomatic negotiation, not violence. It was a clear petition against violence, against war, and for peace. But many of those signatories have been forced to leave the country, and some of them are in prison, and most of the rest of them are going through a series of trials and are unclear about their future in the academy or indeed in Turkey. So that's one thing. And then we have a number of people here from South Africa. We have people here from Brazil, from Argentina.
I don't know if you know, one of the colleagues from South Africa wasn't granted a visa under the current immigration rules as well.
I see.
So it's affected as well colleagues from other parts of the world.
I see. So we have UK migration politics and the looming Brexit, no Brexit world impinging on this conference in a very real way.
Yeah. And it affects our ability to host a conference that is properly international and does what the ICCTP wants to do.
And of course, what happens is that all of these issues become the substance of the conference, right? In some sense, the impediments to holding a conference, to speaking, to traveling, the freedom to travel, to speak, the possibility of having dissenting views or to developing critical perspectives within the academy or developing perspectives in the academy on the world. These are now contentious. These are very controversial, and we just, as you said, came from a session on the various campaigns against gender, what is called
in different parts of the world.
What is called gender ideology by its opponents, who are very often members of the Christian right, both right-wing Catholics and evangelicals or Pentecostals. And this takes different forms in Latin America and in Africa and throughout Europe. We saw the closing of gender studies programs in Hungary very recently, on the grounds that the theory of social construction is not acceptable. We're seeing similar arguments made by the Trump administration against transgender people serving in the U.S. military. That administration has said that the sex with which you are born is your sex, and people can't make or remake anything about that.
Can I ask you about that? Because
Yeah.
gender trouble.
Yes, I remember the
Your
book.
text, you remember
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Clearly people are troubled
Still.
by the politics of gender, still, 30 years on.
Yes, but you know, I'm not sure the people who oppose gender trouble on the Christian right have ever read it.
Oh, yeah,
I met a woman in Switzerland who was very religious and said to me, I pray for you. And I said, oh, why? Why are you praying for me? And she said, because you don't follow the Bible. The Bible says that God created man and woman. And, and she says, it's natural. I said, well, there's a great deal of diversity in nature, you know. And she looked at me and wasn't listening to that. And I said, have you ever read anything I've actually written? And she said, no, I would never read such a book.
But she knew who you were.
Well, she knew who I was, and she understood a set of propositions that are attributed to me, and that was enough. Because she did accept the authority of her church or her church community, and she was given that information from them.
But I read a piece that you've written recently, which is a criticism of the Pope. But in that piece, what I found very interesting was you recognized his commitment, in a sense, to an extension of freedom within the church, but then pointed to the contradictions.
Yes, I mean, I think, in all fairness, the argument against gender ideology, or what the Catholic Church has now called a diabolical ideology of gender.
And those were the words used by the Pope?
Yes, indeed, diabolical. So from the devil, indicating demonization.
Which goes back to what one of our colleagues said
about witch hunting.
Yeah.
And it is true that those of us who work in the area have been portrayed as witches or as devilish figures. And for me, as a Jewish queer person, it's particularly frightening, given that I've also been portrayed with horns or.
In imagery?
Yes, in some imagery.
In some sense.
Yes, kind of playing on the demonic character of the Jew and the lesbian or the queer or the non-gender conforming person.
So a conjunction of anti-Semitism and anti-queer activism.
Well, I have experienced that, and I know some other people have. And there's been an argument circulating in France that it's Jewish lesbians from the United States that have exported this hideous theory.
This ideology.
Yes, but I think, in all fairness, Pope Francis is repeating or elaborating a set of positions that have been elaborated by the Family Council since the 1990s, and I think one of the fears that the Church has is that the social cohesion of the heteronormative family will fall apart, and that's the basis of society and religion. But also they imagine that gender theory, whatever it is, stands for a radical freedom, that we can just decide which gender we're going to be, we can decide our sexuality, we can deny everything that's given about our bodies and make ourselves anew. And they think of this expression of freedom as exceeding what humans are allowed to do. It's an appropriation of divine freedom, or it's a defiance of divine law.
Which goes back to the very old ban on images of God. So there's an ironic.
Yes, maybe we.
In their view.
Yes, I suppose so. Or at least the power of God, the creative power of God, I think, is is the fear. But I do think that there are a wide range of positions on gender. Gender studies has a conflicting number of positions. There's intersectional theory, there's interactional theory, there's performativity, which they tend to focus on and to misconstrue. But it's an interesting moment where there's a public movement against an academic theory because the theory is understood somehow to legitimate or express or foment social movements, when actually academic theories, as we know, and it's part of what we're doing here, academic theories for the most part register what's happening in social movements. They're usually belated.
Yeah.
They don't prescribe what you should do. They're not efforts to indoctrinate people. They're ways of describing changing ways of living gender in the world. Like, oh, okay, what is the theoretical vocabulary we have for understanding trans people, gender nonconforming people, queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual people or practices? What is our understanding of how this is possible, or what gender and sexual diversity looks like? How do we account for it? Why is it demonized? Why is it so fearful when for so many people?
In that case, you could almost say that an attempt to police gender is troubled by what simply is the case, rather than being the result of some type of ideology.
I think that's true, but I also think there's something very frightening about a critical and open inquiry.
Right.
Like just asking the question, well, is it the case that gender is given, or is it acquired, or is it both? Like, to what extent do we craft a gender? Do we do it consciously, unconsciously? To what extent are we crafted by or produced by social norms that precede us, and we don't have much of a choice?
We don't have control of.
Or maybe it comes from an essence that's inside of us, that is a fact of who we are. How do we negotiate those positions, and why is it that people have deeply felt views on these matters? All of which really are to be respected, but have to be in some kind of conversation with one another.
Can I ask you just something about that question of respect? Because many of the religious arguments also come from religions which insist upon the equality of all as the starting point for the religion.
Yes.
And I often find it strange that it's so easy to combine a commitment to the equality of all human beings with forms of prescriptive determination of how people should live.
Yes. Well, let's remember that these are right-wing, and in many cases extreme right-wing versions of Catholicism and evangelical Christianity. And we know that there are very progressive Catholics. There are many gay Catholic organizations. There are many gay Episcopalian and Presbyterian, Methodist organizations that have been struggling for decades to establish dignity and equality for gay, lesbian, bi people within the church, and who are also some of which very welcoming to trans people and trying to accept that challenge and work with it and extend love to all members of their community. So, I mean, the problem is not Christianity. Yes. Right? It's a particular, we can find this problem in many religions. There are, we can find right-wing Judaism. We can find, right-wing Islamist positions. But we also find other openings within religious communities that suggest that religion is a contested territory. And we don't rule it out. It's not. It's in my mind. It's not the enemy. Yes. I mean, there's some pretty bad secular arguments against homosexuality and trans life. Like it's like I'm not. It's not the answer necessarily.
Can I move on from that to contemporary forms of populism?
Yes.
Because the two are linked, unfortunately. The emergence of, in the past 5 years. It existed before, but a concentration of forces in Brazil, in Hungary, in Turkey, in the Philippines, in the United States, of the emergence of forms of right-wing populism, which link to this critique of gender ideology, but which at the same time are linked in some cases to the free market, in some cases to a very strong state, to bed the idea of a left-wing populist movement. And we have many colleagues from Latin America who's committed to that politics. I wonder how you think we play the politics of populism. Is it a signifier we can no longer use? Is it still to be fought over?
Well, I think it is being fought over, and I am surprised that the very definition of populism shifts depending on the language and the region in which it is discussed. For the most part, in France, I would say that populism is by definition right-wing. And
is that the case even in critical circles?
The
assumption is...
for the most part, at least, I mean, I don't live there. I do try to read, and I have friends who send me things, so I'm not an expert. But it has been my impression that populism is considered to be right-wing and reactionary, that it's an upsurge of either the rights of an ethnicity, a race, or a nation. So it's usually tied to nationalism and to xenophobia. And of course, we have seen those versions. They are rampant, and we're seeing them throughout Europe.
Especially in Europe.
Yes, there's no question. The hatred of elites is also part of the definition of populism, but also it's understood in some ways to characterize movements that are speaking or acting in the name of the people, the people who have been suppressed or who are at risk or who understand their lives to have become destabilized, either through new migration or economic policy. But it's there that the question of gender very often takes form, like in, for instance, right-wing populism in Brazil that brought Bolsonaro to power. I mean, he very actively campaigned against gender ideology, thinking that this decadent import from the North was destroying the family and threatening the church, and regular, ordinary people are not able to continue to live their lives with a kind of certainty that the structure of their heteronormative families is the way of God.
And in that case, it's the resurgence of evangelical Christianity as opposed to Catholicism, which 2 or 3 decades ago would have been the underpinnings
Yes,
in Brazil.
yes, it's true. But, you know, what some of our speakers have been asking is what are the economic or financial processes that are going on in these countries such that so many people are suddenly very worried about their livelihood, their employment. Have they shifted to temporary labor? Do they have a pension? Do they have health insurance that they can rely on? There are deep economic anxieties, which I believe are funneled through religious institutions that are saying your family structure, your heterosexual family structure, the bedrock of your lives is being challenged by these people who are coming in with their crazy ideas and who believe in gay marriage or lesbian parenting or gay male parenting or surrogacy or abortion or reproductive technology, you know, that they are ruining everything, right? Now, there is some ruination going on.
Stand-in for a set of other issues.
Well, I think to some degree they're a stand-in, but I also think that in some ways the evangelical church does not provide a critique of neoliberalism or financialization or increased economic disparities. It actually allows you to live with them
and offers some type of
and,
solution, supposedly.
and it puts all the burden on the family and the community to do the care work and provide the social services that states have abandoned. Right?
It's interesting, though, that Pope Francis, by contrast, has emphasized a critique of financialization.
Yes.
So it's slightly different, divergence.
Yes, well, one keeps hoping that his thoughtful reflections on so many matters will extend to the question of gender.
You mentioned the economic conditions which the evangelical church in Brazil, for example, has responded to. Do you think there's been a failure of the left? Do you think perhaps that the turn from a social democratic politics to more or less accepting and adapting neoliberal policies with a human face in some cases, Tony Blair's New Labour, do you think that over a long period of time perhaps that we haven't been able to articulate the frustrations that many people have felt? Or is something else going on?
Well, I do find it interesting that in Latin America, the link between neoliberalism, dictatorship, authoritarianism has always been known, right?
Back to 73.
Yes, Milton Friedman and Pinochet. You know, this was always known.
Yes.
But I think that it's the North, perhaps, that is catching up with what has been known in Latin America for some time. And to go back to your early, I don't know if it's a failure of the left. I'm not so much interested in pinpointing the failure. I think it's very hard to understand financialization. I think the economic analysis that we worked with from Marx has had to be revised and in some ways profoundly supplemented by new analyses. And we are relying on people who understand these processes better than the rest of us. So, you know, we're in a rush. But I think there's a lot of new scholarship that's trying to think about the relationship among these issues, and that's part of what's happening here.
Yeah. Well, it's happened at the conference, hasn't it?
Yes.
Can I ask you on that as well? Because we walked out the last session to come and do this.
Yes.
And I think the first thing you said to me, God, the world is so awful. What
Yes.
do we do?
Yes.
But on the other hand, if you look at what's happened in Brazil, the resistance to Bolsonaro
Yes.
is huge. There's many, many movements driven in large part by feminist activists.
Yes.
And trans activists
Yes.
against Bolsonaro. In many other parts of the world, there is resistance.
Yes, there is.
There are oppositional movements.
Yes.
There are people involved in those movements.
Yes.
It's not necessarily. I mean, it's awful in many respects, but in other respects, there is also still a politics that's taking place.
That's true. I think maybe sometimes, like in an environment like this where we suddenly get a very strong sense of what's happening in South Africa or a very strong sense of what's happening in Brazil or Turkey, there's an initial moment, even though we know many things or some of us try to keep up and read, you hear it from people who are kind of giving testimony. It is their lived lives, and many of them are living political risks as they speak. You register it as awful at the same time that you apprehend the courage of this person and the potential of these movements. I mean, I think that Ni Una Menos is perhaps the most powerful feminist movement we have seen in decades. Right. And here again, I think that many of us who live in the North or in Europe have, and I'm going to include the UK and Europe for the moment. I don't know what time it is, but okay, but we'll just do that. But I think we're seeing mass mobilizations, and many of those mobilizations draw on anti-dictatorship mobilizations. They draw on radical democratic movements. From much longer history, right? Because the opposition to state violence, to police violence in Latin America has very often been an opposition to dictatorship. And when the state or the police fail to respond to the systematic killing of women or the systematic killing of trans people, right? The statistics are absolutely enormous. Or when they are complicitous with those crimes, refusing sometimes to even apprehend them as crimes. You know, there are sometimes engaging in the crimes. And we know this especially given the violent nature of incarceration in a place like Brazil, which has been amply documented. I think that the anti-violence movement has had resources for a very, very long time. Similarly, to go back to your populism question, you know, I was reading about Colombia because I did a piece on the installation artist Doris Salcedo, and she's fabulous. And I saw that a lot of the populist movements were against the guerrillas. They were against state violence, right? They were uprisings of people who had been pushed out of the electoral process, right? Because during the period called La Violencia, if you won, if you got put in government, the first act you did was to outlaw the other parties, right? So everybody became a criminal. And the populism was a way of insisting on being a part of the political process after having been of the people who had been banned from political process. And that's a left-wing populism.
Which is not necessarily a state-based populism.
No, it's not and it's not necessarily nationalistic. Yeah. And La Violencia crossed borders, right? So some of the solidarities we're seeing among Latin American countries, especially in Neo-Na Menos, should not be surprising to us.
Some of the transnational forms.
They are transnational. And I just feel like those forms of uprising and resistance on the part of people who've been systematically expelled from political power, we have to listen to that. That's not hatred of elites. That's not, irrational rejection. That's not necessarily hyper-nationalism. It's not even racism. It's just an effort to have a political voice on the part of people who've been unjustly excluded.
Can we're going to have to go to the next session.
Okay.
Any minute.
Yes, sorry, I'm carrying on.
Question? No, it's great. It's fantastic. I wanted to ask you a last question. The conference,
yes.
The universities, yesterday, we had two scholars from South Africa, Leanne and Kelly.
Yes.
Leanne Naidoo and Kelly Gillespie. They spoke about the student movement and the challenge to critical theory in the context of South Africa, which they said had in effect become institutionalized, had become part of, in a sense, almost university capture by neoliberal forces. The critical theory had become complicit in that, and they insisted on critical theory leaving the classroom, going outside the classroom. I wonder what you think about the place of the university, the place of institutions like this, the conferences we've done, the ICCTP, in light of those challenges.
Yes.
Wendy Brown, for example, has also been deeply critical of what's happened to the university.
Yes.
What do you think there are still spaces within the universities? Can we preserve those spaces?
Right. I think that the challenge, first of all, critical theory is not a burgeoning field. It's under attack by the quantitative social sciences, and sometimes it's just understood as a left enterprise. So it's not exactly in a hegemonic position. The idea of reanimating critical theory now, so many decades after the Frankfurt School, was to see whether it now takes different forms than it did in the mid-20th century. We can still draw on those texts, but those texts don't necessarily give us the only framework for thinking about what the form of critical theory is. So, one reason Kelly and Leanne were invited is precisely because they exemplify a critical engagement with social movements and communities, and they make the university porous. And that's extremely important. The problem with some academic disciplines is that they become niches in a kind of market economy, and then they have to figure out how to enhance their value or how to how to fund themselves, and they become entrepreneurial in their attitude. This is my knowledge, this is my property, this is my standing, my reputation. I think the task of critical theory now is to examine what are the conditions of possibility of thinking. That includes the university. How is it funded? Yeah. What is its future? Does it allow for critical thought? How do we understand the historical and institutional conditions of our own thinking? And how does that enter into what we think about? In other words, how do we engage with a variety of publics to make clear what we do and to also generate knowledge, not just inside the academy, but outside the academy, not just responding to social movements as objects of study, but actually bringing them into the university, yeah. Which includes movements for the rights of workers within universities and the rights of contingent faculty, who very often have no idea whether they're going to be able to keep a job or pay their rent.
And in the UK, the situation is increasingly similar to the States. There's many younger scholars who spend years and years before they can get a post.
Yes, it's really true. So, I mean, I think this is an effort not to build critical theory within the academy. It's actually a way of thinking about the politics of the university in the public world and what we can do to understand what's happening, to offer some kind of language or site for discussion and exchange, so that we can put forward visions of a more radically democratic and just future, or work with people to see what kinds of knowledge production is helpful, what kind of acknowledgement is helpful, what kind of space is helpful. I mean, just coming here, so many people work in isolation, or they feel that they live in parts of the globe that are somewhat distanced from where all the activity is happening. And a consortium like this is an ability not only, well, it's a structure that facilitates new forms of dialogue, but also potentially new kinds of alliance, yes, and even coalition. We stand up for, yes, each other. What happens in Turkey affects people in Brazil. What happens in Brazil affects us in California and in the UK.
And we think through what we can do in the different
We do,
places
because we're developing a global understanding of what the risks of thought are in our times. Yeah. And people live those risks differently, but we're providing support, understanding, and knowledge. And I think that's a contribution.
Can I thank you very much?
Thank you, Mark.
It's been fantastic having you here.
It's been fantastic being with you.
It's been extraordinary.
Great, thank you.
I've learned more than I could imagine.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.